judgment and sentence of this court that you shall suffer the death penalty.
It begins with silence, a life extinguished in a forgotten room, a body no one expected to find, a disappearance that stirred barely a whisper. Across decades, across cities divided by race, poverty, and neglect, a small group of men drifted through the shadows. They were unseen by most, unnoticed by authorities, and unimagined by the victims who crossed their paths. What binds them is not where they were born or how they lived, but the darkness they left behind. Tonight, we follow 10 men through the cold timeline of their crimes, a journey into relentless evil, and the victims time refused to remember. If you want more of these stories, make sure to subscribe now so you never miss the next deep dive. In the meantime, we are curious where you are watching from. Los Angeles, California, 1970. The city was a vast and restless organism, its neighborhoods divided by opportunity on one side and neglect on the other. Beneath the golden glow of studio lights and palm-lined streets lived a different reality, one where poverty, addiction, and forgotten lives created a shadowy landscape few ever chose to see. It was into this world that Samuel Little stepped, moving with the fluid ease of a man who understood invisibility. He did not draw attention. He did not leave a dramatic signature. Instead, he chose victims who were already vulnerable, women who lived with the daily weight of survival, women society rarely protected. Samuel Little's earliest known crimes trace back to this time, though he had already lived a life marked by drifting, fighting, stealing, and imprisonment. He was a former boxer, powerful, physically imposing, with hands shaped by countless hours of training. Those hands would become his deadliest weapon. Little developed an obsession with strangulation, a fixation that seemed to merge fantasy with violence. He targeted women who lived on the fringes, particularly sex workers and those battling addiction. Their lifestyles made them easy to approach, easy to trust the wrong man, and in the eyes of many, disturbingly easy to overlook when they disappeared. In 1970, Los Angeles police departments were already strained. Many deaths of poor black women were logged with minimal investigation. Overdoses, accidents, undetermined causes. These labels were stamped again and again. Little knew this. In interviews years later, he spoke with unsettling pride about how carefully he chose his victims, selecting individuals whose cases he believed would not be thoroughly examined. That belief proved accurate for decades. Through the 70s, Little roamed. Los Angeles was not his only hunting ground. He crisscrossed the United States, drifting through states like Mississippi, Ohio, Florida, Kentucky, and others. He lived in transient hotels, slept in his car, or stayed with women he manipulated into trusting him. His movements were unpredictable, stretching across thousands of miles. To police departments, he was a low-level criminal who committed assaults, robberies, and fraud. They saw him, arrested him, fingerprinted him, but they did not see the monster behind the petty crimes. His method remained hauntingly consistent. He approached women with soft conversation, a calm demeanor, and an invitation to drink or get high. Many entered his car believing they were safe. Then the violence would begin. Little used his strength as a former boxer to overpower them, wrapping his hands around their throats until their bodies went limp. He often posed them, moved them, left them in secluded areas where discovery was delayed or decomposition advanced beyond clarity. Some victims were found quickly. Others were never found at all. The 70s bled into the 80s, and still he remained free. In 1982, he was arrested in Mississippi for the murder of a young woman named Melinda Rose LaPrée. Charges evaporated for lack of evidence. Shortly after, in Florida, he faced trial for another murder, that of Patricia Ann Mount. Witnesses placed him with Mount shortly before her death, yet the jury remained unconvinced. He walked free again, continuing his cross-country drift as if nothing in the world could stop him. The deaths accumulated silently. Women vanished. Bodies appeared in wooded areas, along highways, beside abandoned buildings. Each case was isolated, disconnected, assigned to different detectives in different cities with no communication between them. There was no nationwide database linking violent offenders. There were no systems to track patterns across states. Little exploited these gaps with chilling precision. He knew that authorities were fragmented. He knew that time was his ally. In 1984, he traveled to San Diego and was arrested for kidnapping and assaulting 2 women. One survived the attack and provided a detailed description. Another was rescued unconscious from his car. Little served 2.5 years in prison, but even incarceration did not bring an end. Upon release, he moved to Los Angeles once more, living among communities that had been ignored for decades. There, over the span of several years, he strangled at least 10 more women. It would take nearly 3 more decades before the truth began to surface. In the 2010s, after decades of arrests for smaller crimes, a routine DNA check finally connected him to multiple cold case murders. Investigators began pulling threads. What followed was one of the most staggering confession sequences in American criminal history. Little, now older and incarcerated, began recounting murders from memory with chilling clarity. He described faces, clothing, conversations, the locations where he left the bodies, even the lives the women lived. He could recall the tilt of a jawline, the color of a dress, the way a victim had pleaded or prayed or whispered in fear. Authorities, skeptical at first, slowly realized that his recollections matched Unsolved. Cases across the nation. Dozens of deaths once dismissed as overdoses or accidents were reclassified. Bodies found decades earlier finally had stories. Families who had waited for answers they feared would never come finally understood what happened to daughters, sisters, and mothers. For many, Samuel Little's confessions were the only form of closure they ever received. By the time his accounts were fully assembled, investigators confirmed at least 60 murders, with Little claiming more than 90. He became known as the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States, and yet, for most of his life, he remained invisible, slipping beneath the radar of institutions that repeatedly failed to recognize the scale of his violence. But while Little drifted from state to state, taking his violence with him and leaving confusion in his wake, the city he once hunted in would soon face another predator of its own. A different man, moving through the same neighborhoods years later, watching the same forgotten streets, and choosing victims from the same overlooked communities. As the decades shifted and Little carried his crimes elsewhere, Los Angeles remained vulnerable, and into that vulnerability stepped the next killer in our timeline, a figure whose presence would haunt the city for more than 2 decades. Los Angeles, California, 1984. The heat of late summer pressed against the cracked sidewalks of South Central, a neighborhood long abandoned by promises of renewal. Streetlights flickered over rows of aging houses, and sirens echoed nightly between liquor stores and vacant lots. It was here, in a community already worn thin by economic struggle and distrust of law enforcement, that a new predator began his quiet work. His name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., but in time, the world would call him something far darker: the Grim Sleeper. In 1984, his first known victim was discovered, a woman whose death marked the beginning of a killing career that would stretch across more than 2 decades. But no one recognized the pattern, not yet. South Central was a place where tragedy carried little weight in official records. Women who disappeared were often assumed to have run from hardship, or to have become casualties of addiction. And when bodies were found, the investigations were brief, the conclusions rushed, and the community left with questions that rarely reached the evening news. Franklin lived among the people he targeted. He worked as a mechanic, drove city vehicles, attended neighborhood gatherings, and raised a family. He was the kind of man others would describe as quiet, polite, unremarkable. But behind that camouflage, a different life unfolded. Inside his car, inside the alleys he knew so well, he hunted black women who were vulnerable, isolated, or overlooked by policing systems that did not protect them. His victims were shot or strangled, often left partially clothed, discarded near dumpsters, alleyways, or roadside embankments. Each death struck the same community, yet law enforcement failed to connect the murders. Citizens, activists, and grieving families pleaded for attention, insisting something systematic was taking place. Few listened. Pain in poor neighborhoods rarely travels far. By 1988, the killings abruptly stopped. Or so it seemed. Investigators, confused by the sudden silence, believed the killer might have died, moved, or been imprisoned for an unrelated crime. They called him the Grim Sleeper because of what appeared to be a long pause. But the truth was far more complicated. More than a decade later, in the early 2000s, women began dying again. The methods were the same, the locations were the same, and the echoes of the past, long ignored, returned with devastating clarity. During these years, Franklin blended seamlessly into daily life. He repaired cars, shared meals with neighbors, and carried himself with a casual warmth that masked the darkness beneath. No one suspected the harmless-looking man who greeted them from his driveway or offered advice on fixing an engine. Even those closest to him did not see the signs. That was his gift, his shield. Invisibility through normalcy. Meanwhile, the community grew louder in its demands. Activists marched outside police headquarters, accusing authorities of indifference toward murdered black women. They argued that if the victims had been wealthy or white or residents of more affluent neighborhoods, the city would have mobilized a task force instantly. Instead, years passed with little progress. Only scattered clues and forgotten evidence sat in storage, waiting for a future technology that would finally expose the truth. That breakthrough came in the 2010s when DNA analysis was expanded statewide. A partial profile recovered from old case files matched closely to a young man arrested years later. He was not the killer, but he was the son of one. This familial link led detectives to a modest home in South Los Angeles, where Lonnie Franklin lived quietly, surrounded by neighbors who still considered him friendly and helpful. To confirm their suspicion, undercover officers followed him, eventually collecting a discarded slice of pizza. The DNA on that crust changed everything. It tied Franklin directly to multiple unsolved murders spanning decades. When police arrested him, the search of his home revealed something even more disturbing. Hundreds of photographs and videos of women, some conscious, others unconscious, and many still unidentified. The sheer volume of images suggested that the known victims were only a fraction of those he encountered. Franklin's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. At last, the families who had spent years pleading for recognition finally received answers, though the relief was heavy with anger. Their daughters, sisters, and mothers had not been forgotten by fate. They had been dismissed by a system that failed to value their lives. The trial exposed not only Franklin's crimes, but also the long history of mistrust between black communities and institutions meant to protect them. Convicted of 10 murders, Franklin was sentenced to death. Yet, even that number felt incomplete. Investigators believe he may have killed many more women, some of whom were never found, and others whose identities remain unknown. The long gap that earned him his nickname may not have been a pause at all, but simply a period where his crimes stayed hidden, overlooked by a world that looked past the people he targeted. Lonnie Franklin's story is not only the tale of a serial killer, it is a mirror held up to a city where inequality carved deep lines across neighborhoods, shaping who was protected and who was forgotten. As Samuel Little moved across the United States, claiming victims in state after state, Los Angeles faced its own predator who operated much closer to home, exploiting the same vulnerabilities, preying on the same neglected lives. And as Franklin's reign of terror continued into the late 2000s, Los Angeles remained far from safe. Because while one killer hid behind the disguise of an ordinary neighbor, another would soon emerge from the very same streets. A man whose violence would stretch from alleyways to vacant lots, and whose crimes would haunt the city well into the next decade. Next, we move deeper into South Los Angeles to uncover the story of the man whose crimes overlapped with Franklin's, unfolding in the same neighborhoods among the same forgotten victims. Los Angeles, California, 1987. The year had changed, but the neighborhood had not. South Los Angeles still carried the weight of neglect, still bore the scars of economic abandonment, and still echoed with the unresolved grief of families who felt unseen by the city around them. It was in this landscape, barely recovered from the early killings of the Grim Sleeper, that another predator emerged. His name was Chester Dwayne Turner, a homeless drifter whose presence rarely drew attention, but whose violence left a trail of devastation that stretched across more than a decade. Turner's first known victim was found in March of 1987, the body of a young woman left strangled in a construction area. It was a violent, intimate killing, one that required physical force and a cold resolve, but at the time, it was not recognized as the beginning of a pattern. In South Los Angeles, murders of vulnerable women were tragically common, and the connection between cases often blurred beneath the sheer volume of hardship. Turner moved constantly, slipping between shelters, motels, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. He was a ghost in plain sight, a man with no consistent address and no predictable routine. This transience allowed him to strike without establishing a noticeable pattern, and it helped him avoid the scrutiny of law enforcement for years. Like Lonnie Franklin, Turner targeted women living in conditions that made them easy prey. Women battling addiction, poverty, and instability. Women who trusted strangers because trusting strangers was sometimes a matter of survival. His methods were brutal. Turner assaulted his victims, often sexually, then strangled them with his hands or with makeshift ligatures. The killings were focused, controlled, and hauntingly consistent. Bodies were found in dumpsters, alleyways, behind vacant buildings, or abandoned in overgrown lots. These were places where the dead could lie unnoticed for hours or even days, where discovery depended on chance rather than urgency. As the murders accumulated, some investigators quietly wondered if a serial predator was at work. But the cases were scattered across different divisions, handled by different detectives, and separated by long stretches of silence. Communication between units was limited, and the victims, many of them poor black women, occupied a tragic category that law enforcement overlooked far too often. Their disappearances rarely generated press. Their deaths rarely inspired citywide concern. By 1992, Turner's violence had taken new lives. Women continued dying under similar circumstances, yet no single suspect emerged. In 1993, the wrong man was arrested and convicted for 2 of the murders. He spent years in prison while Turner remained free, and during that time, the killings continued. The error would only be uncovered more than a decade later, revealing the deep fractures in a system that struggled to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Turner's mobility expanded as he drifted into other parts of Los Angeles. He developed relationships, fathered children, and lived with various partners. Those close to him saw a man who was quiet, troubled, often angry, but none saw the darkness that moved beneath the surface. He hid his crimes not through sophistication or planning, but through society's indifference toward the women he targeted. As the 1990s came to a close, Turner's body count had risen dramatically, yet still, he was not caught. He cycled through short jail stints for petty crimes, but none connected him to the murders. It was not until 2002, when Turner was incarcerated for a separate sexual assault, that his DNA was finally collected and entered into expanding databases. That single act changed everything. Cold case files that had sat unsolved for more than a decade suddenly lit up with matches. One match became several. Several became many. Detectives stared at their screens, realizing that the same man had been responsible for murders they had once believed were unrelated or committed by multiple offenders. The truth was overwhelming. Chester Dwayne Turner was one of the most prolific killers in the history of Los Angeles. Investigators retraced his steps, reconstructing years of eye violence. Forensic evidence confirmed his involvement in case after case, untangling the mistakes of earlier investigations. The man wrongfully convicted was exonerated and released, while Turner faced a staggering list of charges. Ultimately, he was convicted of murdering 14 women and the unborn child of 1 victim. The courtroom heard the stories of lives cut short, mothers, daughters, friends, and the pain of families who had waited decades for justice. Turner showed little remorse. He denied responsibility even as the evidence mounted. But his guilt was undeniable, written in the DNA he had left behind and in the patterns that matched across years and neighborhoods. He was sentenced to death, becoming one of the few serial killers in Los Angeles whose crimes spanned the same era as the Grim Sleeper, yet operated entirely independent of him. What made Turner especially terrifying was not only the brutality of his murders, but the fact that he lived and hunted in the same places where families struggled simply to survive. His victims were not overlooked by accident. They were overlooked because society chose to overlook them. Turner exploited that indifference, moving freely through a community that was never given the protection it deserved. And as Turner's case finally unraveled, exposing years of unchecked violence, another pattern emerged. Los Angeles was not suffering from isolated predators, but from a convergence of killers who thrived in the absence of coordinated policing. Serial violence was not the exception. It had become a grim thread woven into the fabric of neglected neighborhoods. But while Turner's crimes dominated the late 1980s and 1990s, the next killer in our chronology would operate silently in the same era, overlapping with Turner's path, yet driven by a different psychology. And unlike Turner, who lived transiently, this next man lived within the very homes and workplaces of the women he targeted. Next, we move to Charlotte, North Carolina, where a killer hid behind familiarity, friendship, and trust, striking victims who knew him personally. Charlotte, North Carolina, 1990. The city was growing quickly, transforming from a regional center into a place of expanding businesses, new suburbs, and a rising middle class. But within the rapid development were pockets of vulnerability. Communities where young women worked long hours, lived paycheck to paycheck, and trusted the people around them, because trust was often the only stability they had. Into this world stepped Henry Louis Wallace, a quiet man with a soft voice, a calm demeanor, and a darkness that not even those closest to him imagined possible. Unlike the predators in Los Angeles who hunted strangers in alleyways, Wallace moved through his community in plain sight. He knew his victims personally. Many were coworkers, friends, neighbors, or girlfriends of men he socialized with. They recognized his face, welcomed him into their homes, and believed he was safe. That familiarity was his camouflage, and it allowed him to blend into their lives with unsettling ease. Wallace had grown up facing emotional turmoil, leaving scars that shaped him long before he arrived in Charlotte. By the time he settled there in the early 1990s, he had developed a pattern of manipulation, addiction, and violence. Drugs became a constant in his life, a way to mask his anxieties and give him the nerve to commit acts he would later describe with chilling clarity. But the drugs alone did not create the predator. Wallace's crimes were deliberate, methodical, and deeply personal. His first known victim in Charlotte was a woman who trusted him enough to let him inside her home. Wallace raped and strangled her, then attended her funeral with other mourners. This became a twisted signature of his, appearing at memorials, offering condolences to grieving families, and pretending to share in their sorrow. It allowed him to watch devastation unfold, confident that no one suspected the soft-spoken man standing quietly in the corner. Over the next several years, Wallace continued his attacks. His victims were young black women, many in their late teens or 20s, navigating work, school, and relationships. They were striving for better lives, fighting through challenges that Wallace understood well enough to manipulate. He used their trust as a weapon, visiting their homes under the guise of friendship, borrowing small things, sharing conversations, even comforting them about personal struggles. Then, when he saw an opportunity, he would turn. The murders followed a pattern of increasing brutality. Wallace often assaulted his victims sexually before strangling them with his hands, towels, or clothing. He left scenes staged to appear like robberies or moments of sudden violence. In some cases, he returned to interact with friends or family members of the women he had killed, playing the role of a supportive acquaintance while hiding the memory of what he had done. For years, police failed to see the connection between these deaths. Charlotte had never faced a serial killer who targeted women inside their own homes, nor one who was personally tied to so many victims. Investigators were overwhelmed by other cases, and Wallace's victims lived in communities that were often underserved by law enforcement. No one imagined that a single man could be responsible for so many tragedies occurring within overlapping social circles. As the body count rose, some members of the community expressed concern. The deaths shared similarities, but no warnings were issued, no public alerts released, and no protective measures taken to inform the women most at risk. Families grew increasingly frustrated, sensing something larger was happening, yet receiving no answers from authorities. It was a failure that would later haunt the city. By 1994, Wallace's compulsion intensified. He murdered several women in quick succession, each death more desperate than the last. The pressure of police finally taking notice, combined with his spiraling drug use, pushed him toward a breaking point. After the murder of a young mother found in her apartment with her infant child nearby, investigators could no longer deny the pattern. Charlotte was facing a serial killer, and he was someone the victims knew. When Wallace was finally arrested, he confessed for more than 12 hours, detailing the murders of 11 women with unsettling precision. He remembered their clothing, their conversations, their final moments. He spoke not with remorse, but with resignation, as though he had been waiting for the collapse of the facade he had built. For detectives, the confessions were devastating, revealing just how close he had been to so many of his victims and how easily he had moved through their lives. His arrest shocked the city. Friends, coworkers, and even the families of victims struggled to comprehend how a man they had known, spoken to, and trusted had committed such horrors. The quiet neighbor, the helpful coworker, the man who attended funerals. That was the face he chose to show the world. But beneath it lived a predator who exploited familiarity, kindness, and vulnerability in a way few serial killers ever have. Henry Louis Wallace was not a stranger lurking in the darkness. He was the darkness inside the home, the person you let in without hesitation. His crimes raised painful questions about policing, about how communities of color are protected, and about how many of these deaths could have been prevented had patterns been recognized sooner. 11 women lost their lives. 11 families waited for answers that came far too late. And as Wallace's case came to a close, another killer in a different part of the country was beginning his own violent path. A man whose crimes would blur state lines, paroling in and out of prison, while leaving a trail of bodies across Delaware and Pennsylvania. Next, we turn to the story of a drifter whose violence escalated rapidly the moment he walked free, Keith Gibson. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 2008. The air was thick with the summer heat, humid and heavy over the narrow streets of the city's worn neighborhoods. It was a place where struggle carved deep lines across daily life, where corner stores doubled as gathering points, and survival depended on navigating a world shaped by hardship. Into this setting stepped a young man named Keith Gibson, restless, unstable, and already familiar with violence. In the early morning hours of July 6th, he would commit the act that marked the beginning of his long and violent trajectory, the murder of a man named Stanley Savin Jones during a robbery gone wrong. That killing did not yet reveal what Gibson would become. At the time, he was just 26 years old, a drifting presence shaped by instability and rage. His mother had raised him as a teenager, and his life growing up in Philadelphia was marked by poverty, fights, truancy, and early brushes with the law. By the time he reached adulthood, he had accumulated arrests for assaults, thefts, and repeated parole violations. Anger simmered beneath the surface, erupting in sudden violence that made him unpredictable and difficult to control. For the murder of Jones, Gibson was arrested, tried, and convicted. He received a 20-year sentence. But those 2 decades would not unfold as intended. More than a dozen years into his term, the machinery of parole opened a door that should never have been unlocked. In 2020, he was released early to a community corrections facility, a place meant to help offenders transition back into society. Instead, it became the starting point of a spree marked by escalating brutality. His release lasted only a short time. After a fight inside the facility, he was sent back to prison, then released again later that same year. The boundaries placed on him were clear. He could not leave Delaware, he could not be out late at night, and he had to report regularly to his parole officer. But by early January of 2021, Gibson broke those rules. He crossed state lines and returned to Philadelphia, slipping back into familiar streets with agitation and violence simmering inside him. The first known murders of his spree occurred in a small convenience store in the Germantown neighborhood. Surveillance footage later showed 2 victims walking inside, unaware that their lives would end within minutes. Gibson entered with a weapon, forced them into submission, and shot both men at close range before disappearing into the night. The killings were fast, decisive, and seemingly without motive beyond the thrill or control they offered him. Days later, he confronted his own mother in the workplace where she served as a supervisor for a mental health organization. The confrontation ended with Gibson shooting her once in the head and leaving her body behind. It was a moment that revealed the full collapse of any emotional boundary he might once have had. For Gibson, nothing was sacred, not even family. When police interviewed him in the aftermath, they quickly discovered he had violated his parole by leaving Delaware. He was extradited, but only briefly. Through a series of administrative decisions, he was released once more, now allowed to return to Philadelphia despite the violence swirling around him. Freedom gave him opportunity, and opportunity led to bloodshed. In May of 2021, Gibson entered a mobile phone store in Delaware. The clerk working that day was a young woman, just 28 years old. He forced her into a back room, shot her in the head, stole phones and cash, and drove away in her vehicle. The entire incident was captured on security cameras, yet Gibson's face remained concealed. He lifted his mask only days later, during another killing. In June, hours before dawn, a woman named Christine Lugo arrived at a Dunkin' Donuts in Philadelphia to open the store. As she unlocked the door, Gibson appeared behind her, pushed her inside, and forced her at gunpoint to hand over the money. Then, despite her cooperation, he shot her once in the head and walked away. Cameras caught everything. There was no disguise this time, no attempt to hide his identity. It was an execution carried out with chilling calm. By now, investigators from both Delaware and Pennsylvania realized they were dealing with a single offender whose violence crossed state lines. They began comparing cases, studying footage, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together a trail of attacks that matched Gibson's movements. His crimes continued over the following days, including armed robberies, assaults, and another murder in Wilmington, where a 42-year-old man was shot multiple times. When law enforcement finally located Gibson, he was armed with a loaded revolver, additional ammunition, and items linked to several of his victims. His arrest ended a spree that lasted only a few months, but left a trail of devastation in 2 states. In Delaware, he faced charges for multiple murders, attempted murders, and robberies. A jury later sentenced him to 7 life terms without parole, plus hundreds of additional years. In Pennsylvania, he still awaits trial for the killings committed there. Keith Gibson's story is one of repeated failures in a system meant to balance justice and rehabilitation. His early release set the stage for violence that might have been prevented. His disregard for parole conditions exposed a dangerous gap in enforcement, and his spree demonstrated how quickly a single individual, untethered by remorse, can inflict enormous harm across communities already fighting daily battles. But the chronology does not end here. As Gibson moved between states leaving bodies behind, another killer in St. Louis had already begun crafting a very different kind of nightmare. One built not on impulse, but on meticulous torture and recorded suffering. Next, we travel to Missouri, where a man named Maury Travis constructed a chamber of horrors inside his own home. St. Louis, Missouri, 2000. The Mississippi River moved quietly along the edges of the city, rolling past warehouses, old brick neighborhoods, and streets marked by decades of economic struggle. St. Louis seemed peaceful from a distance, but in its overlooked corners lived people who fought each day simply to survive. It was in these shadows, away from the bustling nightlife and the polished riverfront, that Maury Troy Travis constructed a private world of unimaginable horror. Where other killers lashed out in chaotic bursts, Travis built something deliberate, a hidden chamber designed for torture, control, and death. Travis grew up in the region, navigating a life marked by small crimes, early jail time, and a constant sense of displacement. He served years behind bars for armed robbery, then tried to rebuild himself upon release. But whatever darkness lived inside him did not stay dormant long. By the turn of the new century, he had transformed a room within his suburban home into a torture chamber. Inside it were restraints, tools, ropes, a stun gun, and a camera that recorded the final moments of the women he abducted. His victims were women living on the margins, many of them sex workers struggling with addiction or poverty. Travis knew these women moved without protection, without witnesses, and often without someone to report them missing quickly. He cruised the city at night, scanning dimly lit blocks, offering rides or money, and drawing women into his car with a calm and practiced demeanor. Once inside his home, the door closed and the world outside vanished. Everything that happened after that remained sealed within the confines of his hidden room, until investigators discovered the tapes. The first known body connected to Travis surfaced across the river in Illinois in April of 2001. A woman named Alesia Greenwade was found strangled and discarded in a rural area. Months later, another victim, Betty James, was discovered in Missouri under similar circumstances. For investigators, these were troubling but isolated tragedies. The link remained invisible. Serial killers who crossed state lines often escaped early detection, and Travis understood that. He used the geography of the region to his advantage, dumping bodies far from where he killed them. Between May and October of 2001, additional victims were found, tortured, strangled, abandoned like afterthoughts on the edge of the city. Each woman was vulnerable, each death violent, each crime committed with a cold detachment that suggested practice rather than impulse. Yet none of these cases led police to a suspect. Travis remained a ghost, returning to his everyday work as a waiter while continuing his sadistic rituals in the darkness of his home. Then, in a moment of arrogance or compulsion, Travis reached out. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch had run a story profiling one of the victims. Travis responded by sending the newspaper an anonymous letter, taunting them, hinting at more bodies, and enclosing a computer-generated map pointing to yet another location where a victim could be found. He signed the message with a reference to a bondage website, disguising his identity, but revealing just enough detail to ignite enormous concern. Investigators traced the map to Expedia, then traced the Expedia search to the computer inside Travis's home. Suddenly, the invisible man was no longer invisible. Surveillance followed, patterns emerged, a search warrant was executed. And inside that modest suburban structure, detectives found the chamber, the physical manifestation of Travis's cruelty. The tapes were the most disturbing evidence. They documented torture, begging, screams, and finally the unnatural calm of resignation as victims realized they would not leave alive. Investigators watched in horror, recognizing women whose bodies they had found, and others whose remains had not yet been located. The footage made it undeniable. Maury Travis was a serial killer operating on a level of sadism rarely seen in American crime. When Travis was arrested in June of 2002, federal charges were prepared. The case was strong, ironclad, built upon physical evidence, video recordings, and his own written communications. But before the trial could begin, Travis took his final act of control. Despite being placed on suicide watch, he managed to hang himself with a bedsheet in his jail cell. Guards missed 2 consecutive checks, creating a window just large enough for him to end his life. His suicide deprived the families of victims of the answers they desperately needed. It also robbed investigators of the chance to learn the full scope of his crimes. While at least a dozen murders were eventually linked to him, many believe the true number is higher. The tapes hinted at victims never found, and Travis's taunting letter implied he held knowledge of even more graves, more stories, more lives extinguished in the confines of his hidden room. St. Louis felt the weight of his crimes long after his death. Communities already vulnerable faced the painful realization that a predator had hunted among them for years. Women whose disappearances went unreported, whose struggles made them invisible to the wider world, were now remembered through the most horrifying of revelations. Maury Travis constructed his world behind closed doors, but the echoes of what happened inside it spread far beyond his walls. His case stands as one of the most chilling examples of a killer who combined calculated planning with unrestrained cruelty. And as the heartland of America grappled with the aftermath of his death, another predator was beginning to move through Florida and Georgia, targeting young women with a methodical pattern of trust, betrayal, and fatal violence. Next, we follow the story of a man whose crime spanned years and states. Paul DeRousseau, Jacksonville, Florida, 1997. The humidity clung to the city like a second skin, settling into every cracked sidewalk, every quiet neighborhood, every dim apartment complex where young families tried to build better futures. Jacksonville was growing, but unevenly. Some communities flourished with new development, while others were left behind, vulnerable and overlooked. It was in these forgotten pockets that Paul DeRousseau began a killing career defined not by chaos or impulse, but by manipulation, patience, and the exploitation of trust. Unlike Maury Travis, who built a hidden chamber of horrors, DeRousseau committed his crimes inside the homes of women who allowed him through their doors willingly. He was tall, soft-spoken, and seemingly gentle. A man who could disarm suspicion with a smile or a quiet compliment. Many of his victims met him through work, through neighbors, or through casual encounters where he appeared helpful rather than threatening. It was this ability to blend into ordinary life that made him so dangerous. DeRousseau's story began far from Florida. Born in Texas and raised in Los Angeles, his early adulthood was marked by instability, small offenses, and a growing tendency toward violence. He joined the Army in the early 1990s, where he met his future wife and began a life that appeared structured from the outside. But beneath that surface, darker impulses simmered. During his time in Georgia, he was accused of kidnapping and rape, though charges were eventually dropped. Later, he was caught stealing and court-martialed. The disciplinary actions pushed him out of the military, and the downward spiral that followed led him to Florida in search of a fresh start. In Jacksonville, Durousseau struggled to hold steady employment. He drifted between jobs: security guard, animal control worker, taxi driver, positions that gave him access to strangers without drawing much scrutiny. Despite a criminal record and a pattern of domestic violence, he continued finding work, slipping through background checks and oversight failures that should have raised alarm. Women he encountered through these roles became the targets of his escalating violence. His first known murder occurred in 1997, when a young woman's body was discovered in a wooded area near Fort Benning. She had been raped and strangled, her remains left in a place meant to conceal the brutality she endured. At the time, her death was not connected to Durousseau. It would take years and DNA evidence before her case finally revealed its link to him. As the years passed, Durousseau continued killing. He met women through social connections or through his work as a taxi driver. His method was chillingly consistent. He gained their trust, entered their homes, bound them, raped them, and ultimately strangled them with cords, belts, or fabric. He often staged the scenes or attempted to conceal the bodies, leaving investigators with few immediate clues. The victims were young black women, many of them mothers or expectant mothers, navigating the challenges of raising families with limited support. By 2001, the violence escalated further. A woman in Jacksonville reported being raped by Durousseau, and he served a brief jail sentence, but the punishment did nothing to slow him. When he was released, he resumed the pattern with renewed intensity. In late 2002 and early 2003, multiple women disappeared in quick succession. Their bodies were found bound, strangled, and left in isolated areas or inside their own apartments. The similarities finally drew police attention. The breakthrough came with a victim named Nicole Williams, whose body was found wrapped in a blanket and dumped in a ditch. Evidence at the scene connected back to Durousseau. When investigators began examining his background, they uncovered a trail of previous arrests, accusations, and a disturbing proximity to other unsolved cases. DNA soon tied him to multiple victims, revealing a pattern stretching across years and states. When Durousseau was arrested in June of 2003, he showed little emotion. As detectives questioned him, he denied involvement, offered explanations, and attempted to minimize details. But the evidence was overwhelming. The murders shared a signature shaped by control, sexual violence, and a reliance on the vulnerability of women who trusted him. Each victim had a life, a family, a future, all extinguished by a man who used charm as bait and cruelty as his foundation. His trial exposed systemic failures that had allowed him to remain free for so long. Employers had not properly vetted him. Red flags in his military record went unnoticed. Prior accusations had not been pursued aggressively. And the women he targeted, women of color living in difficult circumstances, suffered the consequences of a society that often overlooked them. Durousseau was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, though that sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment. From behind bars, he remained a quiet figure, offering no full confession, leaving investigators to speculate about how many more victims he might have claimed. Some authorities believe he killed women while stationed in Germany during his army years. Others suspect additional victims in Florida and Georgia, whose cases remain unsolved. What made Durousseau's crimes so chilling was not merely the violence, but the proximity. He entered his victims' homes, sat on their couches, held their children, listened to their stories. He was a familiar presence, someone they believed they could trust, someone who appeared safe until the moment he revealed a completely different man. And as Florida confronted the truth about Paul Durousseau, another predator had already begun his own deadly work in the Dallas area. A man who would target elderly women in their homes, moving quietly through senior living communities, leaving behind scenes that resembled peaceful deaths until the truth finally emerged. Billy Chemermere, Dallas, Texas, 2016. The sun hung low over sprawling suburbs and manicured retirement communities, casting long shadows across quiet streets where life moved at a gentler pace. In these neighborhoods, elderly residents lived with a sense of comfort and security, surrounded by caretakers, visitors, and friendly faces. It was a world built on routine and trust. Yet beneath that calm surface, a predator walked among them, dressed in plain clothing, carrying no weapon, and wearing the almost invisible mask of a caregiver. His name was Billy Kipkorir Chemermere, and for years he moved through the homes of the elderly with the ease of a welcomed guest and the intentions of a killer. Chemermere had come to the United States from Kenya, seeking opportunity and stability. He worked various jobs, many connected to care facilities or private households. He learned the rhythms of senior living communities, understood the patterns of staff, recognized which apartment doors stayed unlocked and which residents lived alone. He also understood something darker, that elderly women, especially those in declining health, could be killed quietly, without leaving obvious signs of foul play. The deaths began slowly, scattered across multiple facilities. Women were found lifeless in their beds or reclining in chairs, often with pillows near their faces or signs of pressure on their necks too subtle to raise alarm. Medical examiners, unaware of the growing pattern, attributed many deaths to natural causes. It would take years before investigators realized that these deaths were not peaceful endings, but murders disguised as them. Chemermere's method was simple and devastatingly effective. He approached his victims under the guise of maintenance work, delivery visits, or routine care. Once inside, he would smother them with a pillow or soft cushion, applying enough force to silence them without leaving obvious trauma. He then stole jewelry, cash, or valuables, small items he could pawn or sell online. For him, it seemed transactional. For the families, it became an unimaginable betrayal. By 2016, the pattern had begun to take shape, though only in retrospect. Residents across Dallas and surrounding areas died under similar circumstances. Some were missing rings or necklaces. Others were discovered with their rooms slightly disturbed. But the clues were subtle, overshadowed by the victims' advanced ages and existing health conditions. Many families believed their loved ones had simply passed away in their sleep. The breakthrough did not come from forensic evidence, but from the survival of one determined woman. In 2018, a 91-year-old resident heard a knock at her door. Believing it was a maintenance worker, she allowed the man to enter. Seconds later, she felt a pillow pressed over her face. She struggled, fought, and somehow managed to remain conscious long enough to catch glimpses of the man kneeling above her. When he finally fled, she gasped for air and called for help. Her description was clear, specific, and urgently delivered to police. Officers located a man matching her account, sitting in a nearby parking lot, discarding a jewelry box. Inside the box was the identification of another elderly woman who had been found dead earlier that same day. The link was undeniable. The quiet deaths that had slipped unnoticed through senior communities now formed a pattern too clear to ignore. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they uncovered a staggering number of suspicious deaths connected to Chemermere. Dozens of elderly women had died, under circumstances that, upon reevaluation, showed the same hallmarks of smothering. Jewelry taken. Rooms undisturbed. No signs of forced entry. The profile repeated itself again and again, revealing a methodical killer who relied not on weapons or violence in public, but on deception, access, and society's tendency to overlook the elderly. The notion of safety within retirement communities was shattered. Families who had believed their loved ones passed gently now faced the horrific truth that their final moments were stolen by a man they had never suspected. The city of Dallas confronted a case unlike anything in its history, a serial killer who targeted those least capable of defending themselves, who worked in silence, and who hid behind the compassionate roles society trusted most. Chemermere showed little emotion when confronted with the mounting accusations. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the devastation left behind. Investigators continued uncovering new cases, each one linked by time, location, and stolen valuables. The full extent of his crimes may never be known. Many deaths among the elderly go unexamined, and the line between natural causes and quiet murder can blur without careful investigation. Yet the truth that did emerge painted a chilling picture. For years, a predator walked through the halls of assisted living centers and private homes, entering with a smile and leaving with the life of someone who had once believed they were safe. His killings were not acts of rage, but acts of opportunity, shaped by patience, calculation, and an understanding of how easily society could be deceived. Dallas reeled from the revelations, and families fought for answers the system had once overlooked. The investigation into Kemmermere became a turning point in how elder deaths were evaluated, prompting deeper scrutiny and changes in protocol. But none of those shifts could restore the lives taken or heal the wounds left behind. And while Texas grappled with the aftermath of his crimes, another killer, thousands of miles away in Kenya, was beginning his own reign of terror. His methods were different, his circumstances harsher, but his cruelty no less real. He too targeted vulnerable women. He too left communities haunted by his actions. Collins Jumezi Kalusha would claim victims under a very different sky. Nairobi, Kenya, 2021. The city pulsed with noise and motion, matatus weaving through traffic, markets spilling into the streets, and crowds moving under the equatorial sun. Nairobi was a place of vibrant life, of color and energy, but it was also a city marked by stark divides. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, separated by nothing more than a fence or a single street. In the shadows of that imbalance, where police presence thinned and survival depended on caution, a quiet predator began his work. His name was Collins Jumezi Kalusha, and the fear he ignited would spread far beyond the neighborhoods where his victims lived. Kalusha's crimes emerged slowly at first, hidden beneath the noise of everyday struggle. Women disappeared from low-income areas, many working long hours to support families, many vulnerable in ways their communities could not shield them from. Police were called, reports were made, but in a city overwhelmed with cases and limited resources, the disappearances did not immediately spark urgent investigations. Nairobi had seen crime before, yet nothing prepared it for what would soon be uncovered. The first bodies appeared wrapped in plastic bags, discarded in ravines and waterways at the edge of the city. These discoveries shocked local residents, and whispers spread through neighborhoods long familiar with hardship but unaccustomed to such grisly scenes. The victims were young women, many of them mothers or expecting children. Their deaths were violent, deliberate, and cruel. As more bodies surfaced, panic grew. Something systematic was happening, and it was happening fast. The investigation eventually led police to a man who had once been described as quiet, reserved, and unremarkable. But beneath his outward calm lay a capacity for brutality that stunned even seasoned detectives. Kalusha allegedly confessed to killing multiple women, including his own wife. He spoke of the murders with a disturbing ease, recounting details that only the killer could know. His words painted a picture of a man who did not kill from impulse, but from a cold and practiced detachment. The killings appeared to share unsettling similarities. Victims were lured or coerced into secluded areas. Their deaths were carried out with force and precision. Their bodies were disposed of with the intent to delay identification. Each act suggested planning rather than chaos, an understanding of how to move through the city unnoticed and how to exploit its blind spots. For the families, the discoveries were shattering. Women who had left home for work or errands never returned. Their absence became a haunting silence that stretched from days to weeks, then to the terrible moment when their remains were identified. Kalusha's arrest should have brought relief. Instead, it exposed deeper cracks in the system. While awaiting formal charges, he managed to escape police custody along with several other detainees. The circumstances surrounding the escape raised immediate suspicion. How could a man responsible for such atrocities walk out of confinement? Who had helped him? Had someone been paid? Nairobi erupted with outrage. For the families of the victims, it felt like a second betrayal, a failure not only to protect their loved ones in life, but to ensure justice in death. The escape sparked a nationwide manhunt. Posters appeared across the city, news outlets broadcast warnings, and police checkpoints multiplied. Yet Kalusha vanished into the sprawl of Nairobi's vast settlements and rural outskirts. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. With every passing moment, the fear grew that he might strike again, that the cycle of violence could restart in another corner of Kenya, where vulnerable women lived in the shadows. Authorities eventually recaptured some of the escapees, but Kalusha remained missing. Speculation spread. Some believed he fled toward the border, slipping into the anonymity of neighboring countries. Others feared he blended back into the same communities where he once hunted, hiding in plain sight among people unaware of his past. Whatever the truth, the uncertainty weighed heavily on the city. The case forced Kenya to confront uncomfortable truths about its criminal justice system. Questions rose about overcrowded police cells, inadequate security measures, and the treatment of vulnerable populations whose disappearances often went uninvestigated. Community leaders demanded sweeping reforms, arguing that Kalusha's victims were not killed simply by a predator, but by a long chain of institutional failures that made them invisible. For the families left behind, grief mixed with fear. Without a trial, they had no closure. Without his capture, they had no safety. Their daughters, sisters, and wives became symbols of a crisis that demanded recognition, not just in Nairobi, but across the nation. Their stories were reminders of how quickly a predator can exploit poverty and inequality, how quickly trust can be weaponized, and how deeply a community can be scarred by the absence of justice. Even as Kenya struggled to comprehend the magnitude of Kalusha's crimes, another predator, thousands of miles away, was beginning his own deadly pattern. His methods differed, his victims were older, and his movement through cities more calculated. But like Kalusha, he targeted those who society often overlooked. And like Kalusha, his crimes would leave communities devastated. Next, we return to the United States, where a young man in Washington, D.C. and Virginia would earn the name the Shopping Cart Killer, Anthony Robinson, Harrisonburg, Virginia, 2021. Autumn had settled across the Shenandoah Valley, draping its motels, bus stations, and roadside lots in a quiet stillness. The town felt peaceful at a glance. College students scrolling their phones, travelers pushing luggage carts, workers ending late shifts under the glow of neon hotel signs. Yet beneath that calm routine, something sinister had begun to unfold, hidden among anonymous rooms and short-term guests. Into this landscape stepped Anthony Eugene Robinson, a man whose calm demeanor and unremarkable presence concealed a darkness that would soon earn him the name the Shopping Cart Killer. Robinson did not begin his story with a long criminal record. In fact, his past was strikingly clean. No major arrests, no early warnings. He worked in waste management, moved frequently between states, and maintained a quiet existence that drew little attention from neighbors or employers. But behind that ordinary exterior lived a man drawn to vulnerable women. Women he met through dating apps, brief encounters, or chance meetings in budget motels scattered across Virginia and Washington, D.C. His earliest known victim in the timeline of his murders was Aline Elizabeth Redmond, a woman in her mid-50s who disappeared after telling her family she planned to attend a football game with a man known only as Ant. She never returned. Her body was later found abandoned in a remote lot behind a Harrisonburg motel, her hands bound. Investigators had few leads. The scene offered little evidence. Her final hours remained a mystery. Not long after, another woman vanished, Tonita Smith, a mother in her 30s whose last known phone signal placed her near the same motel where Redmond had been found. When her body appeared only feet from the previous crime scene, hidden in the same undeveloped area, authorities finally sensed the pattern forming. Two women, both found near the same stretch of land, both murdered with disturbing similarities. Still, the killer's identity remained unknown. Robinson's method was chilling in its simplicity. He met women through dating apps, presenting himself as gentle, attentive, and eager to connect. His tone was respectful, his appearance calm. He seemed like a man trying to find stability, perhaps someone recovering from hardship. That facade earned him trust, a trust he then exploited. Once alone with his victims, he attacked with sudden violence, killing them through blunt force or asphyxiation before transporting their bodies to a place where he believed they would not be quickly discovered. The shopping cart motif emerged later, after investigators connected him to additional victims found near a Moon Inn motel in Fairfax County. The bodies of two women, Cheyenne Brown and an unidentified victim later known as Stephanie Harrison, were discovered in a large metal container beside a discarded shopping cart. Decomposition was advanced. Identification was difficult. But one detail stood out immediately: the use of a shopping cart to move the bodies after the murders. The image became burned into the investigation, into the press coverage, and into the public's understanding of the man responsible. Cheyenne Brown's case brought a new level of urgency. She was young, pregnant, and had a child waiting for her at home. Surveillance footage showed her stepping off a bus and walking toward a motel where Robinson was staying. Phone records showed communication between them. Family members recalled seeing Robinson inside her home days before she vanished. When her remains were found, along with the body of Stephanie Harrison, the horror of the pattern widened. Robinson was arrested soon after, calmly, without resistance. The man who had carried out such violence presented himself to officers as mild and cooperative, but the evidence was overwhelming. Devices linked him to multiple victims. Footage tied him to locations where bodies were found. DNA traced back to him with staggering certainty. And interviews with women who had survived encounters with him revealed that the violence could have spread even further if not for chance escapes. What struck investigators was how ordinary he seemed. He was not erratic, not loud, not visibly dangerous. He moved from place to place, often homeless, sometimes staying with relatives or short-term acquaintances. He drifted through social circles without leaving strong impressions. That anonymity allowed him to hunt effectively. His victims were often women facing hardships, homelessness, financial instability, loneliness, and they met him through digital spaces that blurred caution with convenience. As details emerged, the public began to view Robinson through a chilling lens. He was a man who could blend seamlessly into everyday life while carrying an unimaginable capacity for violence. His crimes did not rely on elaborate planning or sophisticated manipulation. They relied on opportunity, vulnerability, and the belief that no one would look beneath the surface of a seemingly harmless stranger. The grief of families deepened as more information surfaced. Each woman had a life full of complexity: daughters, mothers, dreams, struggles, hopes for the future. None of them deserved the anonymous manner in which they were taken, nor the indignity of being moved in a shopping cart, discarded as if their lives had no weight. Their families fought to reclaim their stories, to ensure they were remembered as more than victims of a monster who slipped between state lines. Robinson's case remains open in several jurisdictions, with investigators reviewing cold cases and missing person reports for possible connections. Some fear his crimes may stretch further back than currently known. Others believe the confirmed victims represent only a portion of his violence. The truth may take years to uncover. And with Robinson's chapter, the journey through this timeline of darkness reaches its end. 10 killers across decades, across continents, each leaving behind devastation shaped by circumstance, vulnerability, and systemic failure. Their stories reflect not only the minds of predators, but also the environments that allowed them to thrive. Now, as we close the final chapter, one question remains, the same question echoing through every documentary you create. Where are you watching from? Let us know, and maybe, just maybe, keep a little light on tonight, because the next story could be closer than you think.